Do you see Emerson? Look. Do you see yourself in there? Say go hi. Hi everybody. Whoa. Say hi Emerson. We got Emerson today, babysitting for a little bit. Here you go. You want that? Okay. He was just about to sleep, but I had to get him up so you guys could all see him. What do you think? We're sitting out on the back porch. It's a beautiful day today. It's warm and breezy. It's just a perfect day. So today is Sunday, and we have Emerson for a few hours while his mama is cooking up some stuff to take to Daddy's work. So he's hanging out on the porch with me making videos. Alright, I'll put him back in his little chair and then we'll get started with our Shabbat prep radio. Say bye. Bye-bye everybody. See you later. Hey friends, welcome back to Torah Led Homestead. Today we are doing Sabbath Prep Day Radio, episode number 7. Before we get started, I want to light my pink candle sculpted like a rose. If you guys aren't familiar with this, you'll have to go back a couple of episodes to hear all about the details there. I will try to remember to link that up here for you guys and put it in the description box. But got our candle. Where's the wick? It's getting low. I'm gonna have to get a new one soon. Alright, there we go. I'm lighting this candle because this is a special time. So check out the description box to find out why this candle symbolizes a special time for us. I hope everybody is having a beautiful day so far, being very productive on your prep day, and looking forward to a fun and relaxing Shabbat. I'm actually out of town this weekend. I'm on a women's retreat up in central Missouri with some friends of mine from my fellowship. And so if you think of it, pray for me, pray for the ladies that are there. I really hope to be an encouragement to all of the women that are attending, and I just know that it is going to be a really great time. So I won't be answering comments probably too much this weekend, but I'll be back on Sunday and get all caught up with everybody. So say hi in the comments below. Please like the video, and then make sure and share it with your friends when we're done so everybody else can enjoy this Shabbat Prep Radio. Alright, so one of my favorite stories of all time is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It is such a sweet story. If you have not read it, you definitely should. In fact, maybe I'll add it to our list of classics that we read at the end of these Shabbat Prep Radio videos. It's the story of Mary Lennox. She's an orphan girl who goes to live with her uncle in England on his estate. Her uncle is gone all the time, so he doesn't appear in the books too often, but when he does, it's pretty significant. She starts off as a pretty angry, just grumpy, spoiled little girl that's very difficult to like. But throughout this story, she begins to grow and change and blossom into somebody that's actually pretty decent to be around. There are other characters like Dickon, who is just a sweet boy full of joy. He loves to talk to the animals, and he just helps Mary to see life from a different perspective. There's her cousin Colin, who is stuck up in bed. He has just crippled by fear, and he lives his days in a dark room. Very angry and fearful boy as well. But Mary really grows from a place of just hate and self-preservation. And Colin also grows up from his place of immobility. And it is just a wonderful story. So I want to read a portion of this story to you. When Mary discovers a secret garden on the estate, she musters up all her courage and goes to her uncle to ask him if she may have a bit of earth. So her Uncle Craven just happens to be in town at this time. He has not really met her before, and he has a lot of his own issues as well. He has just a lot of depression and just kind of giving up on life sort of a mentality after losing his wife. And he doesn't spend a whole lot of time with his son Colin, which contributes to his whole set of issues. Right, so Mr. Craven, her uncle, is visiting with Mary, and he says, "Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place, and you may go where you like and amuse yourself as you like." Is there anything you want? As if a sudden thought had struck him. Do you want toys, books, dolls? Might I, quavered Mary, might I have a bit of earth? In her eagerness, she did not realize how queer the words would sound, and that they were not the ones she had meant to say. Mr. Craven looked quite startled. Earth? He repeated. What do you mean? To plant seeds in, to make things grow, to see them come alive, Mary faltered. He gazed at her a moment and then passed his hand quickly over his eyes. Do you care about gardens so much? He said slowly. I didn't know about them in India, said Mary. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. I sometimes made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them, but here it is different. Mr. Craven got up and began to walk slowly across the room. A bit of earth, he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his dark eyes looked almost soft and kind. You can have as much earth as you want, he said. You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want, with something like a smile, take it, child, and make it come alive. May I take it from anywhere, if it's not wanted? Anywhere, he answered. There, you must go now. I am tired. So notice Mary wasn't super specific about where she was taking that earth from, and he just gave her permission to get it wherever you can get it. A little over 3 years ago, my husband and I were feeling pretty dissatisfied in our walk with the Father. We knew that he was leading us into something new, but we didn't know exactly what it was. Feeling like we needed a change, we actually went to the pastor of our church and told him that we had decided to leave the church. It felt like the right thing to do. We didn't know why, but this church no longer felt like the right place for us anymore. To make a long story short, the pastor ended up convincing us to stay, and we actually both took on new ministries to hopefully help us want to stick around more. I ended up leading the women's ministries, and I immediately got to work forming a team and planning events. I really got into it. I was super excited. We were going to have a monthly encouragement night with a special speaker and devotions and crafts and food. I was really excited about it, and I started writing up the devotions for the first few months of events. I had been reading The Secret Garden, and I was really taken with this idea of having a bit of earth. I had been afraid to ask this pastor if I could take over this ministry that was lacking in our church. I had been afraid to ask God. For some reason, I felt like I wasn't worthy to lead this ministry. Fear actually had me bound up, like it did with Colin in the story, and it kept me from stepping out in the way the Father was leading. But now that I had done it, I thought of this women's ministry as my bit of earth. I had so many things that I wanted to share with people. The Father had shown me so many things that I wanted to pass along to others. Well, it wasn't meant to be. COVID happened, our church shut down right away, and we ended up leaving that church for good and joining a Torah-keeping fellowship shortly after. I was wrong about my bit of earth. It wasn't that women's ministry. It was actually this channel. For the past several years, Yahweh has allowed slow and steady growth on this channel. And now I'm ready to step out in a few things that are going to encourage even more growth in community. I visited with my family about the importance of this ministry, and everyone has agreed that I should set office hours, learn more about video editing, and even work on my blog that does accompany this channel but gets very little attention. I'm really excited about the community that's growing here, so thank you all for being a part of it. You are that community, and you are a huge encouragement to me. But we don't have to be afraid to ask the Father for things, right? The worst he can say is no. The more we study his word and we learn what sort of prayers he answers and what sort of questions we can ask him that he will respond to, the more we start to align those prayers with his ways, the more we start to want the things that he wants. In Psalm 90, Moses asks the Father to prosper the work of our hands. We know the Father isn't going to prosper everything we ask him about, right? Only the things that are within his will that he finds to be good and worth prospering. It's kind of like when Yeshua says in John 14 and 16 that any prayer made in his name will be answered. Not any prayer. We can't just tack in Jesus' name on the end of something and hope that Yeshua will answer it. He will answer things that are within his will and were within his character, right? The things that will honor him. The more we know him, the more we will pray things that will honor him. When the Father gives us a bit of earth, he expects us to plant new seeds there, but he also wants us to encourage the growth of things that are already there. Kind of nurture that growth, right? And help it to get stronger and bigger and spread out more. Recently I was flipping through the Bible and I came across 2 Timothy 4, 1-5. It says this: I charge you in the presence of Yahweh and Yeshua the Messiah, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? I used to be really nervous about going out and preaching the gospel. I'm not one of those people who will try to sell you something that you didn't ask for, so I'm not really great at like the street preacher thing, right? Where I just kind of like in your face and counter you. I usually just wait for people to sort of come my way or look for opportunities within my daily life to minister to others. A lot of people think that it's only the job of a preacher or an evangelist to do the preaching, but if you read Matthew 28, you'll find that Yeshua gives all of us that command. All of us are to go out and make disciples. All of us are to preach the good news. All of us are to baptize, and all of us are to teach people how to walk in his ways. We can't do that if we don't know what they are. It's for all of us, and like Paul encouraged Timothy, I want to be ready in season and out of season. That's pretty much all the time, right? That phrase, in and out of season, can also mean whether or not it's convenient, and that goes into the whole Romans 12 thing about offering ourselves as living sacrifices. The plan was for all of us to do this nurturing, for all of us to be gardeners. We all work together to make a beautiful garden. So there's some things that all of us can do, no matter where we are, who we are, what our limitations are. All of us can pray. All of us can choose positivity in our thoughts and in our words with one another. All of us can control criticism, right? The Bible talks a lot about controlling our tongue. All of us can give encouragement. All of us can share our testimony. And all of us can be ready with answers for any questions that come our way. The more we study the Word, the better we are at answering why we believe what we believe. And when you know that, the Father will start sending people your way so that you can tell them why you believe what you believe. And then you will be growing disciples and teaching them the ways of Yeshua. I'll shift gears here just a little bit. I was scrolling through some notes and I found this quote. It says, "It's not our current life we're giving him, but our future one." It's not our current life we're giving him, but our future one. I can't remember if I had said that or if somebody else had said it, but I found it to be really profound, right? Because it can be really easy to give Yahweh our current life, especially if we're going through hard times. We're like, here, you can have it. I don't want it anyway. But to give our entire future ahead, that can be really risky, right? What if we don't end up where we're planning to end up? What if things change that we don't want to change? Fear of the unknown holds us back, even from the things that we know our good Father wants to do in our lives. Well, as I was writing this all out, I remembered where I had read that quote. It was in one of my old vlogs that I had written in 2010 when I was just 31 years old. I want to read that to you. This article is from June 8th, 2010 on my old blog, and it's called "The Life We Don't Yet Know." I was flipping through an old journal tonight and came across an entry dated March 14th, 2000 with this quote from Jeff Lucas. "The life we give Jesus is the life we don't yet know." At the time of that entry, I had been following Christ for about a year and a half, about the same amount of time that I had been married. Our first child was only 3 months old. My husband and I were both 20 years old. I don't remember, of course, what went through my mind at the time that I wrote that down, but I'm sure I had no idea really what it even meant. I was still another 3.5 years away from the day when I would cry out to God and ask him to forgive me for my on and off loyalty to him, my husband, and my family. The day that really turned my life around for the better. I was still another 7 years away from the most horrible day of my life yet, when I screamed into a bath towel at the top of my lungs for half an hour as I delivered my miscarried child at 8 weeks along. I was still 10 years away from the day that I would plead with God with complete peace and belief in his goodness for the life of the child I was delivering in an emergency procedure. The child who turns 1 month old tomorrow and is sleeping peacefully and healthily at the other end of the house now. By the way, that child is almost 13 years old. So many times we are afraid to give God our lives because they are filled with so many things that we don't want to give up. When God was asking me to give my life back to him in the fall of 1998, I was reluctant for several reasons. I knew that by completely laying down my will, I'd no longer be allowed certain pleasures. The seemingly innocent flirtations and attentions of men who weren't my husband. The ability to settle any dispute with a string of profanities, a slap across the face, maybe even a shove to the ground for whomever I was arguing with. I'd have to be responsible to an earthly authority, my husband, and a heavenly authority, God. I'd have to give up my music, my movies, my mind games, and my manipulations. And I'd have to be honest, and I'd have to be vulnerable. On one hand, I wish that I could have taken my 19-year-old self on a time travel tour of what life would be like just a decade later, although I have a feeling that the former me would not be able to recognize the present me, so it would be a wasted trip. But what peace and comfort and calm that would have brought to the younger me. On the other hand, if I had known then what I know now, I wonder how much of it I would have screwed up trying to make sure it happened. And I wouldn't now have the joy and wouldn't feel such overwhelming thankfulness in looking back to see what a beautiful thing God has made of my life. God is so faithful. He can be trusted. He loves us. I thought I knew what life I was giving God when I gave him my life 11.5 years ago. I thought I was giving him the life of a lying, disobedient, unfaithful, hate-filled, and very hurt girl who had grown up way too fast and thought she knew it all. In reality, God destroyed all of that in the transfer. What I was really giving him was a clean white canvas on which to paint the masterpiece that is and will be my life. I was giving him at least 11 years, 10 months, and 20 days of the beautiful marriage of two best friends. I was giving him my 3 oldest children. I was giving him the opportunity to step in and consecrate my life and roles as mother and wife. I was giving him my next 2 children. I was giving him the open door to change my heart and draw me close through the loss of our first miscarriage. I was giving him my next child, and the chance to show us all a miraculous healing in our 7th. God, what else have I given you? What are you going to do with the next hours, days, or even years of my life? I'm still giving you my life, and I'm still trusting you to make it so much better than I could ever have dreamed to ask you for. Thank you for proving yourself faithful over and over. And since then, wow, how much more has he done with my life? 2 more children, 25 years of marriage, a daughter-in-law, a baby grandson. We've moved clear across the country, and we're now following his instructions that we didn't even realize existed back then. I can look back at 31-year-old me and think, wow, so much has changed. And just like I didn't recognize myself in my 19-year-old me back when I was 31, this 43-year-old me doesn't even remember 31-year-old me. Times have changed. And I'm hoping that in another 10 or 12 years, I will be so much more refined that I will be difficult to recognize to that me. I'm so thankful for the Father's growth and refinement in my life. Speaking of growth, I'm getting ready to work on my herb garden next week when I get back from the retreat. And I'm planning to plant more herbs than ever. So I dry my herbs and keep them in jars all throughout the year. This is one of our jars of basil. I've just kept it in a pickle jar. This one is mint. I got quite a few of these. We also do oregano and thyme and just all kinds of different things. But I need to plant a lot more this year because we have run out. I've run out of thyme and oregano already. So I need to make sure and plant a really big herb garden this year. I want to read a short article that I found in a magazine on planting herb gardens, since that is one of the things that we do at the very first of the planting season, because many herbs can tolerate the cooler weather. I got these magazines. They're Keepers of the Home. I believe it's a old Anabaptist publication, but I'm not positive. A friend of mine a couple of years ago gave me a huge box of these, thinking that I would enjoy reading through them, and I do enjoy reading through them, but I just was reminded of them last night and thought, I'll bet there is some really great stuff in there for Shabbat Prep Radio. And I did find an article on herb gardening, so I'm going to read this to you. So this is from the winter 1998 edition of Keepers at Home magazine. It says, in the spirit of Titus 2, which is cool because that's what we had been talking about a couple weeks ago here on the channel. And this article is by Gracia Schlabach from Berlin, Ohio. It says, God created herbs for man's pleasure and well-being. Having an herb garden opens up tremendous possibilities of culinary, medicinal, and visual enjoyment. Plus, herb gardening involves low investment, especially if you grow your own plants or get starts from a friend. An herb garden concept gives a breath of fresh air to the flower bed tradition too. Rather than pretty flowers just to look at, you have attractive, useful, edible plants that help you be self-sufficient. If you are planning a new garden, you will find how-to books quite helpful. Most herbs love full sun. A rule of thumb is at least 6 hours of full sun per day. Good drainage is also important. A southern slope is ideal according to the above. If poor drainage is an obstacle, you may decide to create a raised bed. Many herbs will tolerate shade, a few even prefer it. Their foliage might be a little bit more sparse than in sunny conditions, and they will need more phosphorus, bone meal is one source, rather than nitrogen. The great majority of herbs will thrive in acid to neutral soil, pH 6 to 7, with the exception of a few lavender, anise, and fennel, which must have alkaline soil, and sage, basil, and yarrow, which will tolerate quite acidic soil. It's a good idea to position the herb garden so that it's easily accessible from the kitchen. This gives you the liberty of taking a quick snip even while the soup's on. And also having the herb garden in a spot where you'll walk past or see it almost every day lets you keep an eye on the growing process, not to mention weed patrol. If you have limited space, you can plant herbs in containers, placing them on your deck or patio. Another option is a window box. The vast smorgasbord of plant choices makes it both delightful and challenging to select. First, decide on the basic purpose of your herb garden. Are you interested mainly in culinary herbs, medicinal and tea herbs, herbs that attract bees and butterflies, specific color groups such as brilliant reds and oranges or subdued grays, tough herbs for rock gardens? Most herbs will overlap several categories rather than fit into only one. Your proposed site will also help you plan. Will you need plants that appreciate full sun, thrive in shade or moist corners, plants for containers? Start simple and add to your herb garden from year to year. This is important if you are a new herb gardener. Let's say you're planting a new culinary herb garden. Choose several plants you know, like parsley, dill, and mint, and several you don't know as well, perhaps basil, chives, or thyme. This gives you a basis of both familiar flavors and experimental flavors that lead to more discoveries. Next year, you can add a few more plants as time and budget allows. You can add to your herb garden using the more plants method or the add a section method. With the more plants method, fill up your new garden's extra space with annuals, nasturtiums, calendula, or basils, and eliminate some of these the next year to make room for permanents. The add a section method adds an entirely new section. Using the more plants method, my herb garden numbers 30-something after starting with a basic dozen about 5 years ago. Considering your chosen site and the plants you expect to plant, the next step is plotting the layout, deciding where each plant will be planted. Place the tallest plants in the back. In a round bed, put them in the middle, to prevent them from shading the smaller ones. For a most balanced look, plant several same plants beside each other rather than scattered throughout the garden. Intersperse different colors, shapes, and textures. For example, broad-leafed sage enhances fern-like dill, and smooth dark opal basil is striking next to woolly white artemisia. You'll want some bright colors throughout the garden, not only on the one end. A unified color theme enhances your layout, maybe several groups of blue and yellow flowering plants in different parts of the garden. Define the garden's edge with something permanent like bricks or wood for a finished look. A hedge-type plant like hyssop or thyme planted around the border of the garden is attractive too. Leave some walking space if you cannot reach all the plants from the edge. If you'd like a charming extra touch, a flagstone path dotted with thyme is perfect. Even though curves and circles in your layout create visual interest, they cut down in space and efficiency. Okay, so reading through that gets me kind of excited to plant my herb garden. I think I'm going to put in, rather than put in a bunch of new herbs, I think I'm just going to put in a higher quantity of herbs that I already use. And then I might try a couple of new things that I haven't yet done. My family really likes to drink tea, and I think that finding some herbs that we can use in teas will be a big plus to our garden this year. So I hope that encouraged you. Let me know in the comments, are you a gardener, and what sort of things do you like to put in your garden? Have you ever done herb gardening? I'd love to hear any tips or tricks that you have to help an herb garden flourish. Alright, so now is the time of the video when I read to you from a classic literature book. We are currently reading Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So we're on chapter 14. You can jump in here, or if you need to catch up, go ahead and go back to some of the other Shabbat Prep Radio episodes to find your spot. I always put them at the very end of those videos. Right? Chapter 14, Pride and Prejudice. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all. But when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and with the most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behavior in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he had himself experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses which he had already had the honour of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and had sent for him only the Saturday before, to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighbourhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved all the alterations he had been making, and had even vouchsafed to suggest them herself, some shelves in the closet upstairs. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?" "The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property." "Ah," cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court." "Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer these little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself peculiarly bound to pay." "You judge very properly," said Mr. Bennet, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study?" They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard? And if he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow and hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming it at any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank, and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes, that a mistress for it might be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take it upon her to say, she could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter she must just mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely to be very soon engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself. For thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet with little cessation of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had been always sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room in the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk, and Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or really new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be. And Kitty and Lydia, determined, if possible, to find out, led the way across the street, under pretense of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, a very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably when a sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly toward them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed color, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave, and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they would come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlor window, and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop-boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more draughts to Netherfield because the Miss Bennets were come away, when her civility was claimed toward Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillip was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put an end to by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would have certainly continued the occupation. But unluckily no one passed the windows now except a few of the officers, who in comparison with the stranger were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen. But though Jane would have defended either or both had they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something, he supposed, might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. So much silliness going on in Meryton. I hope you all have a good and productive prep day and a happy Shabbat full of lots of rest and relaxation and time with the Father. Thank you so much for stopping by. Please like and subscribe if you have not, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.